The state of Israel is a really small country. Not only it is small, but it is surrounded by Muslim nations such as Lebanon from the north, Syria from the northeast, Jordan to the east, and Egypt from the southwest. Since Israel announced her independence on May 14, 1948, Israel was at war 16 times with her neighbors. Additionally, almost each day this small country of about 9.5 million people experiences multiple attempts of terror attacks. Fortunately, thanks to Israel police, most of those attacks are detected and stopped. Nevertheless, Israel has a tough neighborhood. You can say it is the only democracy in the Middle East, surrounded by countries that dream to push Israel into the Mediterranean Sea. Of course, both Jews and Muslims claim that the land on which they live is their land. We know this conflict, and it has a very strong religious background. But what if I tell you that Israel is controlling just a fraction of the land promised to them in the Bible? In this episode, we will look at a special promise given to Israel by God and see what it would mean geographically if Israel was to claim that land. But before we do that, please remember to give a like to this video, subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so yet, and leave a comment. I really enjoy reading comments from you, and even though sometimes I don't have time to answer all of them, I try to read them all. So thank you very much for all your comments. With that out of the way, let's start our episode. Just to give you an understanding, the United States is about 448 times bigger than Israel. Israel is approximately 21,937 square kilometers, while the United States is approximately 9,833,517 square kilometers, making the United States 44,726% larger than Israel. So, Israel does not have a lot of land. But if we look at the promise God has given to Israel that this nation will possess land from the Nile River to the Euphrates River, then we are looking at the territory of about 2,387,669 square kilometers. Just to give you a perspective, this is as big as the territory of Kazakhstan, which is the 9th biggest country in the world. Have you ever heard of Kazakhstan? I hope you did, because it's a big country. Anyways, let us look closer at this special promise given to Abraham. In Genesis 15:18, we read about a special promise God gives Abraham.
In the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, Unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates.
Two rivers are mentioned in this passage, the Euphrates River and the Nile River. I would like you to remember those two rivers because they are very important in understanding Israel's history. At the mouth of the Euphrates River, the history of Israel begins. It is here, in the ancient city of Ur, Abraham's family is called to begin a journey to the Promised Land. In the 12th chapter of Bereshit, the first book of Moses, we read that Abraham and his family left Ur and moved to Haran, from which they have moved to the Promised Land. Just to give you a perspective, this is approximately 3000 BC. The Promised Land is of course the land where today we have the state of Israel. We read that Abraham traveled with his family as far as the great tree of Moreh in Shechem. By the way, this is kinda cool that this tree was so significant that it was some kind of a direction point. Was that a big tree? Was it a weird looking tree? Was it an olive tree or an oak tree? What do you think? Anyway, apparently this tree was so distinct that in Abraham days people knew where this great tree of Shechem was located. We also read that at that time the Canaanites lived there, and so the land was not empty. This is significant because in 1948 the land of Israel was also full of Arab people living there for centuries. Despite that Canaan was not a desert and people are living there, God tells Abraham he will give him this land. In Bereshit 14:14, we read that God makes an even stronger statement saying that this land will be given to Abraham's descendants forever. This promise is repeated again and again to Abraham's son Isaac and to Isaac's son Jacob. This is critical information because some people could say, okay, but Abraham had many sons, for example Ishmael. And so, some people would say, yes, the land is promised to Abraham's descendants, and the descendants of Abraham are Arab people. The problem with this approach is that God repeats the same promise to Isaac and then to Jacob. In Bereshit chapter 17, God tells Abraham that his eternal covenant will be established with Isaac and not Ishmael. Actually, if you remember the biblical account, when Isaac is born, Ishmael and his mother needs to leave the tents of Abraham. This is very symbolic. The promise of the land will continue, but only through Isaac. The same can be said about the sons of Isaac. It was Jacob that was the promised one, and not Esau. Even before they were born, God foretells that Jacob is the one that he has chosen, and the younger son Jacob will receive the benefits of the promise given to his grandfather Abraham. And what is astonishing is that Isaac favored the older one, Esau, and if it would be his choice, it would be the stronger brother who would continue the promise. But that was not the plan of God. And so Jacob is the forefather of the nation of Israel. Jacob has 12 sons that become the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, returning to Israel's history, the events experienced by the Patriarchs is a microcosm of what will happen to the whole nation. All the three biblical heroes, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, left the promised land and lived in a foreign country. Abraham went to Egypt, where he lied to the Pharaoh about Sarah being his sister. The imminent destruction of the promised land was only prevented because God did not allow it. Next, on his way to Egypt, Isaac was stopped by God in Gerar, the land of Abimelech, king of the Philistines. Like his father, Isaac lied, calling Rebekah his sister and creating envy in the hearts of the Philistines due to his prosperity. This prosperity of Isaac in the foreign land eventually caused that Isaac was forced to leave their land and return to the promised land. Lastly, Jacob left the land twice. First, as a young boy, he escaped from the anger of his brother Esau to live in Padan Aram, located today on the Syrian and Turkish border. This time, Jacob did not deceive, but he was deceived by Laban and suffered envy caused by his prosperity. Eventually, Jacob also leaves Laban in secret fear and hurry. The second time Jacob left the land was as an elder, after which point he never returned. However, on his deathbed, he ordered his sons to bury him in the grave of Abraham and Isaac in the Machpelah cave in Hebron. And so, the cycle of the three patriarchs ended in the land promised by God. And so is the plan for the whole nation of Israel. The two rivers, Nile and Euphrates, become a marking point for Israel's history. Nile is the greatest river of Egypt and the reason why this ancient nation became so powerful. Egypt is a place of exile for Abraham, for Jacob and his 12 sons, and eventually for the whole nation of Israel. However, we must remember that Israel's presence in Egypt is not random, but is foretold by God, who announces in the first book of Moses, the same day that he gives the promise to Abraham, that the new created nation will have to spend there 400 years. The Euphrates River is another great river that contributed to the development of powerful nations such as Babylon and Persia. It is the place where Israel's history began. It is where Abraham was called, and a place where the Jewish people were exiled for 700 years. Now, returning to the original land promise given to Abraham by God, we see why the boundary of the two great rivers were given. At the banks of those two rivers, very important events occurred. First, the Hebrews returned from Egypt after 400 years in exile, and later the Jewish nation returns from Persia after another 70 years in exile. If we take the promise given to Abraham literally, then Israel is promised a much bigger land than she possesses now. From the river Nile to the Euphrates River, we can draw a land of 2,387,669 square kilometers. Now, I know that some people would say that this promise was realized in the times of Solomon. The problem with that is that Solomon never went as far as the Nile River in his land conquests. Besides, his kingdom did not last too long and was quickly divided and shrinked. The second argument is that the promise given to Abraham does not really mean the river Nile, but the Wadi Nile, meaning some smaller creek of the Nile River, and Solomon's kingdom did in fact touch the Euphrates River to the north. The problem with this interpretation is that after the rivers are mentioned, God provides specific territories occupied by different people, and so we have the land of Kenites, Kenizzites, Kedomites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephathites, Amorites, Canaanites, Gerishites, and Jebusites. Those tribes lived on a territory that went far beyond the land that Solomon possessed. But even if we take the minimalist view that the promised land is the land that Solomon possessed at the height of his reign, then even if we take that view, Israel is still far from possessing such a great land. Others say, well, since Solomon fulfilled the promise, it does not apply today. Besides, today, we are all the spiritual offspring of Abraham, so it doesn't matter anyway. There are so many problems with this statement. First of all, God says the land promise is eternal. Eternal means forever, and not just a few years in history during Solomon's reign. So just because Israel possessed the land at some point in history, it does not nullify the eternal promise given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Second, yes, the New Testament says that Christians are the spiritual sons of Abraham. But, as we discussed, Abraham had many sons, but the land promise was only passed through Isaac and then Jacob. The New Testament does not say that Christians are the spiritual sons of Jacob, does it? And let us remember that the descendants of Jacob are the ones that create the nation of Israel. As you remember, God showed grace to Hagar and her son Ishmael and gave them a special promise. In the same way, Christians can participate in certain blessings due to the spiritual heritage realized through faith, but it does not mean that Christians are the new Israel. Israel is Israel. Christians are Christians. Now, the descendants of Jacob can become Christians, believers in Christ, but Christians can't become Israel if they are not the descendants of Jacob. This is quite simple, but I realize this sometimes creates problems in understanding, and maybe I will make a separate episode about this. Let me know if you would like to hear more about this topic. So, to sum up, Israel does not possess the land promised to them by God. The current state of Israel is just a fraction of the territory promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, even if we take the minimalist view from the Wadi Nile to the Euphrates River as seen in the territories conquered by Solomon. Israel history is connected both with the Nile and Euphrates River. Those rivers are currently on the territories of Egypt and Iran, but Israel has an eternal promise from God that in the future this territory will belong to the chosen nation. Thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I realize it was a bit different than the episodes I did in the past. Let me know what you think of such episodes, where I focus more on biblical narrative and theology. Was it interesting for you? Or should I stick to archaeology like I did in the past? Also, I want to give a special thank you for all the people who decided to support the channel, either by becoming a member on YouTube or a patron on the Patreon page. I really appreciate your support. It motivates me to continue this work. If you would like to join as a member, just go to the main channel page and click join, or you can click on the Patreon icon in the top right corner. Also, don't forget to subscribe, like this video and leave a comment. By doing this, you help me in reaching more people worldwide, and it's free. I wish you all the best and see you soon in the next video. Shalom.